And one of the things that I can probably talk about here is just to ask some questions, really, that we're interested in. And these are things like what happens or what can happen when people and places implicated in, and to some extent actually constructed in museum representation, actually shift and change and multiply. What happens when the desire for fixity that you have in the Enlightenment model of museum, the making permanent of knowledges and peoples and places, is actually dislocated by a new sensibility towards population movements, towards population flows and different demographics, and multiplicity of heritages, ethnic diversification. And one of the questions that we can ask is should museum representations change, or should the mechanisms whereby museum representations take place change? And one of the things which Professor Basso Peresut talked about before was the issue of cultural memory and how this works in terms of museum representation. One of the things that we have to ask is whose cultural memory is at play and whose identity is being constructed by those cultural memories. We see migration flows in terms of peoples, but do we see co-respective migration flows in terms of knowledges? And it's interesting in terms of the technical work of museums in the UK, at least, when we talk about migration of knowledge, migration of information, it's a technical term to think about changing classification structures, documentation structures, and these kinds of things. But ultimately, these are epistemological questions as well as they are technical and classificatory ones. And ultimately, they bear on the politics of knowledge and the politics of identity. So it's these sorts of questions that I guess we're interested in. Just some more topics. The play of interpellation, how people are appealed to through representations of place. The appeal to what Graham Rolls calls people's insideness and ideas of place attachment. Or, on the other hand, disinheritance, where cultures are presented as someone else's, which is an idea from Ashworth and Tunbridge's dissonant heritage. And this encapsulates the different strands, intellectual strands that we bring to this. On one hand, heritage studies, as you can see, but on the other, some of our work coming out of social psychology and understanding people's relationships to place, people's affective and intellectual and identity relations to place, which is what we're interested in. And also the consumption or reception of museum representations, articulating the relationships between places and peoples. So how does this work in terms of objectives? Those were the topics, if you like. What do we want to do? Well, these are the things. To investigate aspects of the relationships between museums, place, and identity in Europe, from the development of the nation states, notably in the 18th and the 19th century, to the present day. So there's always this nexus, if you like, between places, cultures, identities that we're interested in. To study the relationship between museums and the multidimensional and potentially shifting territory in which they're situated and which they purport to represent, a territory which is geographical, political, and epistemological. One of the ways in which I've thought about museums in the recent past is to think of museums cartographically as maps, and maps are things with which we locate ourselves. So the question then is, how can the museum function as a map? How do we redefine cartography? And how do processes of self-location work, or do they not work? And how might we, as I say, rethink cartography to take account of different identity politics, different demographic politics within 21st century Europe? And lastly, to examine how museum actions like collecting and display have articulated and articulate the relationships between places, people, and cultures within geopolitical conceptual frames, like the nation, like the region, and Europe. And one of the key things here is that those conceptual frames may not appeal to everyone or may not be relevant to everyone, and we need to question that notion of relevance for different people and different visitor groups. So some of the things that we need to do to study the changing practices of representation, interpellation, and audience participation in the context of population dynamics and flows and diversified conceptions of place. Place as both roots and roots, as it says. And to study producers' intentions with regard to such representations, which means qualitative data collection talking to producers, talking to curators, talking to politicians, talking to those who are in some way, directly or indirectly, responsible for the production of representation. But on the other hand, to study visitor understandings of such representations and to evaluate their congruence or incongruence with visitors' individual senses of identities. And this is, I think, where we want to do something a bit ambitious and a bit new, because studying representation in museums is quite common. It's quite a common intellectual project. But actually matching that, or trying to match that with study of consumption and the production-consumption dualism is something that you can challenge, but for the purposes of this, let's not worry about it. It's something that's quite difficult, and that's why not many people do it. But we hope to do it in the context of this opportunity, of this project. And we hope that that will provide a foundation and a bedrock for some of the other work packages to develop. So just very briefly, in terms of the timing, we have to work through literature review and historical contextual research. I don't like calling it background because that devalues it, and that's not what I want to think about at all. We need to do desk research, and we need to identify particular case studies where we can go and study representation, we can go and study visitors, and we can gather qualitative data, and we can also do a display analysis, as you see there. One of the things that we want to do is pilot some of our methodologies so that we can fine-tune them and in relation to a case study which will act as a testing ground. We also have the qualitative data collection there, as you can see, against the different months in terms of the timing, and our analysis and writing up. And then we have the main outcomes and deliverables, like many of the work packages, the midterm report, the final report, the think tank itself, in which we'll gather together different perspectives on the work that we're undertaking so far and use that as a stimulus to provoke further directions within our work package and the international conference. So I think that's all I need to say from the point of view of work package 1. It's had to be very descriptive because I have finished my time. But if anyone is interested in asking me more detailed questions about this, then come and approach me or Rhiannon, my colleague, and we'll be happy to talk about these things more. So now I need to pass on the floor to someone else.